Edit. Asked the black woman in your hallway what happened in Chicago. Grant Whitmore stopped laughing. The voice on the phone was calm, almost too calm, and for one strange second, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Around him, 3 attorneys stood beneath the warm lights of his marble mansion, their expensive watches catching the glow from the chandelier. Aaliyah Carter stood near the open doorway with a folded linen towel in her hands. She had been invisible to them for the last 20 minutes. Not literally. They had walked past her. They had spoken over her. They had laughed while she stood close enough to hear every word. But now Grant was staring directly at her. "Who is this?" he asked into the phone. The answer came softly. Grant's jaw tightened. His eyes moved to Aaliyah again. She knew that voice. She knew exactly who was calling. And the moment she recognized it, something cold settled beneath her ribs. Grant Whitmore was 48 years old, the white CEO of a technology company worth more than $1 billion. He was used to people waiting when he spoke, used to doors opening before he reached them, used to his name changing the temperature of a room. Aaliyah was 32, black, and wearing the dark blue uniform she had worn nearly every weekday for the past 11 months. To Grant, she was the woman who polished the glass, arranged the flowers, and carried coffee into rooms where no one ever asked her opinion. 10 minutes earlier, he had made that clear. "You clean my house," he had said, smiling as the attorneys watched. "Don't pretend you understand my company." Aaliyah had not raised her voice. She had not argued. She had simply looked at the contract lying open on the table. "I understand the part you skipped," she had said. The smile had disappeared from his face. Then he had laughed again, louder this time, as if volume could turn her observation into a joke. Now the phone was pressed tightly against his ear. "What did you say?" Grant asked. The voice on the other end answered. His fingers slowly tightened around the device. Aaliyah watched the change happen in silence. First, the color left his face. Then his shoulders stiffened. Finally, the confidence that had filled the room only moments before seemed to drain away, leaving something unfamiliar behind. Fear was too strong a word. Not yet. But uncertainty had arrived. "That's impossible," Grant said. Aaliyah lowered her eyes. She knew it was not impossible. She knew exactly what had happened in Chicago. She knew the name of the company. She knew the year. She knew the decision that had changed her life. And she knew that Grant Whitmore had once been standing much closer to that decision than he realized. The voice on the phone spoke again. Grant stopped breathing for half a second. Then he turned toward the doorway. Toward Aaliyah. "You know her?" he asked. Aaliyah slowly lifted her eyes to meet his. For the first time since she had entered his home, Grant Whitmore looked at her as if he were seeing a person instead of a position. Aaliyah said nothing. She didn't need to. The phone had already begun telling him the truth. The room stayed quiet after the call ended. Grant Whitmore lowered the phone from his ear, but he did not move. The 3 attorneys watched him carefully, waiting for the next order, the next sharp question, the next display of control. None came. Aaliyah Carter remained near the doorway, holding the folded linen towel against her side. She had learned long ago that silence could reveal more than questions ever did. Grant looked at her again. "What happened in Chicago?" he asked. Aaliyah's fingers tightened slightly around the towel. "I do not know what you mean." It was a careful answer. Not a lie. Not the truth either. Grant took one step toward the table, then stopped. The contract still lay open beneath the warm chandelier light. The page she had warned him about remained visible, the clause he had dismissed only minutes earlier sitting between the signatures like a quiet warning. One of the attorneys cleared his throat. "Grant, we should continue the review." Grant did not look at him. "Leave." The attorney blinked. "All of us." I said leave. The room emptied slowly. Leather shoes crossed the polished floor. Briefcases closed. The heavy front door opened, then shut. Within seconds, the mansion became strangely still. The kind of stillness that made every small sound feel important. The refrigerator hummed somewhere beyond the kitchen. A clock moved 1 second at a time. Aaliyah folded the towel once more, even though it was already perfectly straight. Grant watched her. "You knew who was calling." "Yes." "How?" She looked toward the window. Outside, the last light of evening rested over the lawn, turning the glass dark enough to reflect both of them. Grant saw his own reflection first. Tailored suit. Silver watch. Shoulders held high. Then he saw Aaliyah beside him, still wearing the same uniform he had mocked. "Because I know her voice," Aaliyah said. "Who is she?" Grant asked. Aaliyah did not answer immediately. 11 months earlier, when she had first arrived at the Whitmore estate, no one had asked about her past. The hiring manager had asked whether she could work early mornings, whether she could handle long days, and whether she was comfortable staying out of the family's way. Aaliyah had answered yes to all three. She had never explained that she once spent her mornings in conference rooms instead of kitchens. She had never mentioned the degree hanging in a storage closet of her small apartment. She had never told them that she knew how to read financial reports, corporate filings, and acquisition agreements. She had never said that before becoming a housekeeper. She had been an analyst who believed that careful work could protect people from careless decisions. Life had taught her otherwise. "The woman who called you," Aaliyah finally said, "is Eleanor Whitmore." Grant's expression changed. His mother, the founder of the company he now led, the one person whose calls he never ignored. "My mother has been in the hospital for 3 days," he said. "I know." Grant stared at her. "How do you know that?" Aaliyah lowered her eyes. "Because I visited her." The question came before he could stop it. "Why?" Aaliyah looked back at him. "Because she asked me to." The clock continued ticking. Grant glanced at the contract again, then at the woman he had called a housekeeper. Somewhere beneath the polished floors and expensive furniture, an old story was beginning to surface. And Aaliyah knew that once Grant heard the whole truth, he would never again be able to pretend that she had simply appeared in his hallway. Grant did not move for several seconds. Eleanor Whitmore. The name seemed to change the air inside the room. His mother had built the company from a small office in Chicago into one of the most powerful technology firms in the country. She had taught him how to read a balance sheet, how to recognize a bad deal, and how to never confuse confidence with wisdom. Yet he had spent the last 11 months believing that the black woman who quietly cleaned his house could not possibly understand the business he had inherited. "You visited my mother," Grant said. "Why would she ask you to come?" Aaliyah placed the folded towel on the edge of a nearby table. "That is something you should ask her. I am asking you, and I am telling you that she can answer it better." Grant stared at her. There was no anger in her voice. That made the answer harder to dismiss. He was accustomed to people reacting to pressure. Some became nervous. Some apologized before he even finished speaking. Aaliyah did neither. She simply stood there, calm beneath the soft light of the mansion, as if she had nothing to prove. Grant had always assumed that people who worked in his home were there because they had no other options. He had never considered how much he did not know about them. Aaliyah had arrived at the estate every morning at 6:30. She knew which windows caught the first sunlight, which flowers needed fresh water, and which rooms Grant preferred to keep closed. She knew how to make a house look untouched by the people living inside it. What Grant did not know was that before 6:30 each morning, Aaliyah spent 40 minutes reviewing medical bills for her mother, organizing prescription schedules, and checking the small bank account that had become thinner month after month. He did not know that the blue uniform was not a reflection of her ability. It was simply the job that had allowed her to keep a roof over her mother's head while rebuilding a life that had been interrupted years earlier. He did not know that. She had once worked in a Chicago office with glass walls and polished conference tables. He did not know that she had been the youngest financial analyst on a team reviewing one of Whitmore Technology's most important divisions. And he certainly did not know that her name had appeared in an internal report connected to the very company he now controlled. "You have been here almost a year," Grant said. "Why did you never tell me any of this?" Aaliyah looked at him. "You never asked." The answer landed more heavily than he expected. Grant glanced toward the dark window. His reflection looked exactly as it always had. Expensive suit, controlled expression, a man who believed he understood every room he entered. But the woman standing beside him had been carrying a history he had never bothered to see. His phone vibrated again. This time, the message came from Eleanor. Grant read it once, then again. His eyes slowly lifted toward Aaliyah. "She says you were there," he said. Aaliyah remained silent. "In Chicago," Grant continued. 20 years ago, the mansion seemed to grow colder. Aaliyah looked toward the hallway, where the polished floor reflected the faint glow from the chandelier. "Yes," she said. Grant's voice lowered. "What were you doing there?" Aaliyah finally turned back toward him. "Trying to warn your company. Trying to warn your company." The words remained between them. Grant looked at Aaliyah as if he had heard the sentence but had not yet understood its meaning. 20 years ago, he asked. "Yes." "About what?" Aaliyah glanced toward the contract still lying on the table. About the same kind of thing that is happening now. Grant's eyes moved to the document. The room seemed smaller than it had a few minutes earlier. He picked up the contract and turned to the page she had identified. You saw this before? I saw the structure. You are not a lawyer. No, you are a housekeeper. Aaliyah met his eyes. That is my job here. Grant said nothing. It was a simple distinction, but one he had never considered. For 11 months, he had looked at her uniform and decided he already knew the limits of the person wearing it. Aaliyah had learned to live with that kind of judgment. She had encountered it in offices, airports, interviews, and conference rooms. Sometimes it came through a question, sometimes through a pause, sometimes through the sudden change in a person's voice when they realized she was not the person they expected to see. She had stopped explaining herself years ago. Explaining required people to care enough to listen. In Chicago, she had been 22 years old and working as a financial analyst for a consulting firm that had been hired to review a major expansion by Whitmore Technologies. The company had been growing quickly. Too quickly, according to the numbers. Aaliyah had found inconsistencies in a series of financial projections. Revenue had been counted twice. A liability had been placed in a separate entity. A group of investors had been given information that did not match the internal records. She had prepared a report. She had taken it to her supervisor. Her supervisor had told her to wait. She had waited 3 days. Then she had gone higher. You went to my mother? Grant asked. I went to the person who had authority to stop the deal. And what happened? Aaliyah's gaze lowered for a moment. She never received the report. Grant frowned. What do you mean? Someone removed it before it reached her. The words were quiet. The effect was not. Grant looked back at the contract in his hand. Who? Aaliyah shook her head. I never found out. But you lost your job. She did not answer. She did not have to. Grant understood the shape of the story before he knew the details. A young black analyst raises a concern. The concern disappears. The deal continues. The analyst becomes the problem. The company moves on. Years pass. People forget. But numbers do not forget. Aaliyah pointed toward the page. That clause is designed to hide responsibility. Grant read it again. The words were written in polished legal language, the kind that could make a dangerous decision look ordinary. How did you recognize it? He asked. Because I have seen it before. Grant's phone vibrated once more. Another message from Eleanor. This time, it contained a photograph. Grant opened it. The image was old, slightly faded, taken in a Chicago office 20 years earlier. A much younger Eleanor stood beside a group of employees. Near the edge of the photograph was a young black woman with intelligent eyes and a folder held against her chest. Grant stared at the face. Then he looked at Aaliyah. The resemblance was unmistakable. His voice became almost a whisper. That is you. Aaliyah did not deny it. Grant looked again at the photograph, then at the contract, then at the woman he had told not to pretend she understood his company. Why did you come here? He asked. Aaliyah's expression remained calm. Because your mother asked me to. Because she asked me to. Grant looked at Aaliyah for a long moment. The answer was simple, but it opened a door he had spent years keeping closed. His mother had never mentioned Aaliyah. Not once. Yet Eleanor had somehow known exactly where to find her, exactly what she had been doing, and exactly when Grant needed to hear the truth. What did my mother ask you to do? Grant asked. Aaliyah looked at the photograph still glowing on his phone screen. She asked me to watch. Watch what? Your company. Grant let out a quiet breath. You have been working in my house for almost a year because my mother wanted you to watch me? No, Aaliyah's voice remained steady. I have been working in your house because I needed a job. Your mother contacted me later. Grant looked toward the hallway. The mansion suddenly felt different. Every morning, Aaliyah had entered through the side door while he had walked past her without looking up. She had carried boxes, organized rooms, and quietly moved through a home filled with people who knew the price of everything but rarely asked who was doing the work. He had believed her silence meant ignorance. Now he wondered whether it had meant patience. What did she tell you about me? He asked. That you were making decisions too quickly. Grant's expression hardened. My mother has always believed I moved too quickly. She was more specific this time. Aaliyah reached into the pocket of her uniform and pulled out a small envelope. She placed it on the table beside the contract. Grant looked at it, but did not touch it. What is that? A copy of the report I wrote 20 years ago. His eyes lifted. You kept it. I kept a copy. Why? Aaliyah looked toward the window. Beyond the glass, the lawn had disappeared into darkness. Because when people tell you that you are wrong, sometimes you need proof that you were not imagining what you saw. Grant's face changed. The sentence was not dramatic. That was what made it difficult to ignore. He picked up the envelope and opened it carefully. Inside were several pages, old but preserved. The first page carried Aaliyah's name. Beneath it was a detailed analysis of a financial structure connected to Whitmore Technologies. Grant read the first paragraph, then the second. His eyes moved faster. The same pattern appeared again and again. Hidden liabilities, misleading projections, responsibility divided across companies so no single person appeared accountable. The exact kind of structure he had just been preparing to approve. This was never delivered to my mother, he said. No, who stopped it? I told you. I never found out. Grant turned another page. At the bottom of the report was a signature. His own. He stared at it. Aaliyah watched him carefully. You signed the termination notice, she said. Grant's fingers stopped moving. I was 28. I know. I did not know what this was about. I know that too. Her calmness unsettled him more than anger would have. Grant looked at her. Then why are you telling me? Aaliyah answered without hesitation. Because the same thing is happening again. He glanced at the contract. You think someone is hiding something. I know someone is. For the first time, Grant felt the room shift beneath the certainty he had built his life around. His phone began ringing again. Eleanor's name appeared on the screen. He answered. He said nothing. His mother's voice came through softly. Grant, listen to her this time. The call ended. Grant lowered the phone. Aaliyah stood in the warm light, still wearing the uniform he had once used to define her. He looked at the contract, the old report, and the woman who had recognized the danger before anyone else in the room. Then, he asked the question he should have asked 20 years earlier. What exactly did you find? Grant did not answer immediately. He looked down at the old report in his hands while the rain began tapping against the tall windows. The sound was soft, steady, almost careful. Aaliyah stood near the table, her reflection faintly visible in the dark glass. For the first time that evening, neither of them seemed interested in winning the conversation. The numbers did not match, Aaliyah said. The company reported strong growth, but the cash flow did not support it. Several obligations had been moved into separate entities. On paper, everything looked clean. In reality, the risk was being pushed somewhere no one was looking. Grant turned another page of the report. And the current deal? The structure is different. The intention is not. He looked up. You are saying someone is hiding risk. I am saying someone has made it difficult to see who carries the risk if the deal fails. Rain traced thin lines down the glass. Somewhere in the mansion, a heating system clicked on, then settled into a low hum. Grant had spent his life surrounded by noise. Meetings, phones, engines, applause, people speaking quickly because they believed speed was proof of intelligence. But standing in that quiet room, he noticed things he had never noticed before. The faint scent of clean linen, the reflection of the chandelier in the window, the way Aaliyah kept her hands folded in front of her, not because she was nervous, but because she had learned not to waste movement on people who had already decided not to listen. Why did you stay? Grant asked. Aaliyah looked at him. Stay where? At my house. Her eyes moved briefly toward the hallway. You needed someone to do the work. That is not what I meant. I know. Grant placed the report on the table. You knew who I was. Yes. You knew I had signed that notice. Yes. And you still came here every morning? Aaliyah looked down at the old pages. My mother needed medical care. I needed income. Your house had a position available. The answer was practical. That made it harder for Grant to hide behind emotion. Aaliyah had not entered his home to punish him. She had not spent 11 months planning some dramatic revenge. She had simply needed work. The fact that she had found it in the home of the man who had once signed away her career was something neither of them had expected. Grant walked toward the window. Outside, the rain had grown heavier. The lawn had become a dark blur beneath the night sky. My mother said you were the only person she trusted to review this deal, he said. That is not what she said. What did she say? Aaliyah waited. She said I would not listen to anyone else. Grant closed his eyes for a moment. The truth was difficult because it sounded familiar. His mother had warned him about the contract. His attorneys had offered careful explanations. His executives had assured him everything was under control. He had heard them all, but he had not listened. Then Aaliyah had spoken one sentence from the hallway, and he had mocked her before even asking her name. His phone vibrated on the table. A message appeared from an unknown number. Grant picked it up. There was only one sentence. You should ask who prepared the first report. He looked at Aaliyah. She had already seen his expression change. Who prepared it, he asked. Aaliyah turned toward the rain-darkened window. You already know. Grant stared at the message again. The room fell silent. And slowly, a name from 20 years ago returned to the surface of his memory. The name returned before Grant could stop it. Daniel Mercer. Aaliyah said nothing. Grant stared at the rain sliding down the window. Daniel Mercer had been the senior executive who supervised the Chicago Review 20 years earlier. He had been older, respected, and trusted by everyone in the company. Grant remembered him as the man who had taught him how to speak in meetings without sounding uncertain. The man who had told him that difficult employees could damage a company faster than bad numbers. The man who had placed a termination notice on Grant's desk and said, "Sign it. We will move forward." Grant had signed. He had not read the full report attached to it. He had not asked why Aaliyah Carter was being dismissed. He had simply trusted the person standing above him. Now the memory returned with uncomfortable clarity. Daniel Mercer is not with the company anymore, Grant said. No, Aaliyah answered. He left 3 years after I did. Where is he now? I do not know. Grant looked at the message on his phone. Then who sent this? Aaliyah did not answer. Grant opened the current acquisition file again. He moved through the pages more carefully this time. The language was polished. The numbers appeared reasonable. But once he knew what to look for, the pattern became visible. One company held the assets. Another held the debt. A third held the obligations connected to the expansion. The names were different, but the structure carried the same logic Aaliyah had identified 20 years earlier. This cannot be a coincidence, Grant said. No, Aaliyah replied. It is not. Grant turned toward her. You knew this before you spoke. I suspected it. And now I know. He looked at the contract. How? Aaliyah reached for a folder resting on the side table. She had placed it there earlier, beneath a stack of household documents. Grant had never noticed it. She opened the folder and removed several printed pages. These are public filings from the last 18 months. She placed them beside the contract. Look at the registered addresses. Grant leaned over the table. The companies appeared unrelated. Different names, different offices, different directors. But the addresses were connected. So were several of the legal firms. Grant's expression grew still. Who prepared this deal? Your chief financial officer's office. Grant looked up sharply. That is not possible. You said the same thing about Chicago. The sentence settled over the room. Grant looked at the old report, then the new documents. 20 years had passed. The names had changed. The offices had changed. The technology had changed. But the warning signs were still there. And this time, the person standing beside him had seen them before anyone else. His phone rang again. The number was blocked. Grant answered without speaking. A voice came through. You finally opened the file. Grant's eyes narrowed. Who is this? The voice ignored the question. Ask your chief financial officer why Daniel Mercer is listed as an outside advisor on the deal. Grant looked at Aaliyah. She had already gone pale. Not from fear. From recognition. The voice continued. And ask him who kept Aaliyah Carter's report from reaching Eleanor Whitmore. The call ended. Grant lowered the phone slowly. For the first time, the truth was no longer a distant story from Chicago. It was standing inside his company again. And this time, it had found its way directly into his home. Grant stood in the center of the room with the phone still in his hand. The rain continued against the windows, steady enough to make the silence feel even deeper. Aaliyah remained beside the table, her eyes fixed on the documents spread across the polished surface. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Then Grant reached for his phone and called his chief financial officer, Michael Reeves. The call went straight to voicemail. Grant tried again. This time, the line connected. Grant, Michael said. His voice sounded tired. I was about to call you. Where are you? At home. I need you at the office tonight. There was a pause. Is something wrong? Grant looked at Aaliyah. Yes. Another pause followed. What happened? Grant glanced at the contract. I found an issue with the acquisition structure. Michael did not answer immediately. What kind of issue? The kind that should have been identified before the agreement reached my desk. The silence on the line changed. It was small, almost invisible, but Aaliyah noticed it. Grant noticed it too. I will be there in 30 minutes, Michael said. No, Grant replied. You will stay where you are. Michael's voice became more careful. Grant, I do not understand. I know. Grant ended the call. He placed the phone on the table. Aaliyah looked at him. You believe he is involved. I believe I do not know who I can trust. That is different. Grant looked at her. How? You are finally asking the right question. The words were not cruel. They were simply true. Grant looked down at the documents again. For years, he had believed leadership meant having answers. He had built his reputation on certainty. People had trusted him because he spoke as though doubt had never entered the room. Now doubt was everywhere. It sat inside the contract. It waited in the names of companies he had never heard of. It lived in a message from a blocked number. And it stood quietly in front of him, wearing a dark blue housekeeping uniform. Grant picked up the old report. I need to know what happened to this. So do I. You never found out? No. After 20 years, you still want to know? Aaliyah looked toward the rain-covered glass. Some questions do not disappear because people stop asking them. Grant lowered his eyes. That sentence stayed with him. He remembered the first time he had seen her in the house. She had been standing near the staircase with a basket of clean towels. He had walked past her while speaking on the phone, never looking at her face. He remembered asking why the flowers had been moved. He remembered the way he had spoken to her. He remembered the word housekeeper, and how easily he had used it as though it described the whole of her. Aaliyah, he said. She turned toward him. I owe you an apology. She did not respond. Grant continued. Not for tonight. For something that happened 20 years ago. I signed a document I did not understand. I accepted someone else's judgment without asking what happened. That decision affected your life. Aaliyah watched him carefully. Yes. Grant swallowed. I am sorry. The rain continued. Aaliyah did not smile. She did not tell him it was all right. Instead, she said, then do something with the apology. Grant looked at her. What do you want me to do? Find the truth. His phone rang again. This time, the caller identification showed a name. Eleanor Whitmore. Grant answered. His mother's voice was quiet. Grant, the person who sent you that message is not your enemy. Grant looked at Aaliyah. Who is it? Eleanor paused. Someone who has been waiting 20 years for the company to finally listen. The call ended. Grant turned toward Aaliyah. For the first time, he did not see a housekeeper standing in his hallway. He saw the person who had warned his company before he ever understood what a warning was worth. And this time, he was ready to listen. Aaliyah did not answer immediately. Grant's apology remained between them, fragile and unfinished. Outside, the rain had begun to slow, leaving the windows covered in thin silver trails. The mansion was quiet now. No attorneys, no assistants, no voices filling the space with certainty. Only the faint hum of the heating system and the soft ticking of the clock above the hallway. What happens now? Grant asked. Aaliyah looked at the documents on the table. Now you stop the deal. Grant nodded once. And the company? You begin an independent review. Of the entire transaction? Of everyone involved in it. Grant understood what she meant. That would include people he had trusted for years. It would include Michael Reeves. It would include the legal team. It might include decisions that had already been made. If I do that, the board will ask why. Then tell them the truth. Grant looked at her. You make that sound simple. The truth is usually simple. People are the ones who make it complicated. He almost smiled, but the expression disappeared before it fully formed. Aaliyah had a way of saying difficult things without making them sound like speeches. Grant picked up the contract and closed the folder. Will you help me? Aaliyah looked at him for a long moment. 20 years earlier, she had tried to help the company and had been ignored. Tonight, she had been mocked before anyone asked what she knew. Yet she was still standing there, still offering the one thing she had been offering all along. The truth. I will help the company, she said. Not you. Grant nodded. That is fair. The next morning, the rain had cleared. Aaliyah arrived at the Whitmore estate at 6:30, as she had every weekday for nearly a year. The front door opened before she reached it. Grant stood on the other side. He was wearing a simple gray sweater instead of the tailored suit he usually wore. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he stepped aside. Good morning, Aaliyah. She looked at him. He had said her name carefully, as though he understood that knowing it was the smallest part of what he had failed to know. Good morning. She entered the house. The hallway looked exactly the same. Marble floors, tall windows, soft morning light. But something had changed. On the table near the entrance was a new envelope. Grant had placed it there himself. Aaliyah opened it. Inside was a letter addressed to the board of directors. It acknowledged the failed review from 20 years earlier. It acknowledged that Aaliyah Carter had raised concerns that were never properly investigated. It acknowledged that Grant Whitmore had signed a decision without understanding the full circumstances. And it requested a formal investigation into the current acquisition. Aaliyah read the letter in silence. "You signed it," she said. "Yes." "You know what this could cost you?" "Yes." "Your position, your reputation, your company." Grant looked toward the morning light. "I know." Aaliyah folded the letter. "Then why do it?" Grant answered quietly. "Because you were right 20 years ago, and I do not want to be wrong in the same way twice." Aaliyah looked at him. There was no grand celebration, no applause, no sudden transformation that erased the past. There was only a man finally accepting responsibility for something he had once been too important to question. A week later, the board approved the investigation. Michael Reeves resigned before the review was complete. Daniel Mercer was contacted. The old report was reopened, and Aaliyah was offered a position overseeing ethics and risk review. She accepted it on one condition. The company would create a system where every employee, regardless of title, could raise a concern and be heard. Grant agreed. Months later, Aaliyah stood in the lobby of Whitmore Technologies beneath a new glass sign bearing her name. Grant walked past, stopped, and gave her a quiet nod. She returned it. Nothing more was needed. She had not become powerful because she was finally given a title. She had been valuable long before anyone bothered to look closely. And as sunlight moved across the floor, Aaliyah Carter walked through the building she had once tried to warn, no longer invisible, not because the world had suddenly become fair, but because she had never allowed its judgment to decide her worth.